acts, and this is how this group acts. This is not diversity training. This is not cultural competency training. It's a workshop, right? So when we talk about cultural competency, you're going to see a couple of things. You see words like ability. You see to work effectively with people from different cultures and backgrounds. You'll see things around a diplomatic mindset, even agile cultural learning. You'll also talk about it's a set of skills and knowledge that can help you learn, reason, and solve problems. What we have to understand is that the cultural competency work starts here. It's an inside-out approach. So if I give you a checklist on how you are to interact with another group or another individual, I've done a disservice to that person and as well as you. So in order for us to have some understanding about what cultural competency is, we've got to get to some of the root of our core values and beliefs. And for many of us, we're probably becoming more and more aware of what our friends believe and value than ever before. Things are made public statements, people are making decisions, people are printing t-shirts, everything is happening, but we are not truly examining some of our own core values and beliefs. What I like to say is that for many of us, we were raised a certain way. We hold foundationally to that, and we say this is the right way to be. But for others, we run as far away from that as possible, and we end up taking some sprinkles in between. So what we have to understand is that when things arise, when statements come up, when we're in situations and we've tried to figure out where did it come from, it usually came from your gut, your core. And so why do we respond the way we do? What have we been fed? How do we believe? That's the work we have to do. And when we shift that into organizational practices, we make statements like, we're a welcoming and safe organization, we're a welcoming and safe agency, but have we truly evaluated our core values and beliefs? Have we examined the policies, the practices, the behaviors, the decisions that we make? So it's important that we understand, we look at the definition of cultural competency. And we want to talk about, what is it that we value? What do you believe to be right? How do you define things like professionalism? We hear that word tossed around all the time. And so if someone comes into your space of work and they don't exemplify the same core values and presentation that the majority has, are they then deemed unprofessional? Do they fit into the cultural context of your agency? Have you in fact shared the codes with them to be successful? So those are pieces of work that we have to do that starts in here before we move out there. So we really want to talk about this intentional leadership perspective, right? If we're in this business world, whether you're in education, whether you're in a company, an organization, we have to ask ourselves, what is the intentionality of what's happening? So for me, when I wake up and I walk into a room and walk into a space, I am intentionally and unapologetic about the work that I lead. My goal and my job is to build your capacity. Sometimes it does not feel good, but as a leader, I need to examine my own values and practices. So if I'm going to talk about this intentional leadership perspective, really starting to ask myself, who am I as a cultural being? Have you ever stopped to reflect, like, who am I? Am I a white woman? Am I a black man? Am I a white man? All of these things, right? So when I step into a space, I can tell you that I am a black woman 365 days of the year. I don't negotiate whether I'm going to be black or not. I don't shift that out of the rooms that I walk into, but it's part of my DNA and my character. So part of that means that there are things that are going to impact me differently than the people that I'm talking to. And I may have to take that into perspective to build their capacity, right? So who am I as a cultural being are things that I need to evaluate personally and professionally. And how do you describe the culture of your organization? So if I was to come to you, I'm a new member of the Chamber of Commerce and I want to come and talk to you, and I say, talk to me about the culture of your organization. What would you say? And how do you identify that? What work have you done to assess it? What are your values, beliefs, behaviors, your language, class, race, ethnicity, and worldviews? For many people, that might not be a topic or a consideration that you've even had to consider. For others, it's a daily negotiation. When we talk about what's very public and present that's happening right now, we've got to have some honest conversations about this. We cannot say, we want to talk about cultural competency, but don't talk about race. It doesn't work that way. I want to talk about cultural competency, but don't bring up the implicit bias work. It does not work that way. So we have a responsibility to dig deep into all of it, not just the surface level things that make us comfortable. We have to shift. Shift happens, S-H-I, F as in fabulous T, shift happens, right? And we have to be able to do that. 3, we want to ask ourselves, what are the values, beliefs, behaviors, language, class, race, ethnicity, and worldviews that those you are in business with bring to the table? So what I'm hearing right now is many businesses and organizations are like, we want to have a social justice platform However, we don't want to lose money, or we don't want to lose partnerships. So we need to ask ourselves, what does valuing diversity really mean? And so just because we have a value statement, have we shifted our hiring practices? Have we examined any barriers in that? Have we looked at books, material, and media that we print? Have we examined our values around the table and conversation? Who's in the room that maybe doesn't look like us, and how do we bring them in? What does valuing diversity really mean? So we have to move beyond value statements to value action, right? And if we're going to institutionalize this cultural knowledge, that means that we're going to embed it into practice daily, not just for the right now, but for the endeavor of the system, the agency, or the organization. Do we really, truly value that diversity? So I shift this conversation to add in some pieces around implicit bias. And the reason why I do that is because we cannot have a cultural competency conversation without having an implicit bias conversation. So when I think about how we examine our own core values and beliefs, what do we believe about people? What do we have levels of comfort around race? Some of us get really uncomfortable when that topic comes up. Some of us get really uncomfortable when the meeting shifts to how do we diversify our workforce? Some of us get really uncomfortable, but we have to ask ourselves, what biases do we hold that may be barriers to successful outcomes for our business? And when we think about cultural competency and we think about the statements around valuing diversity, and then we hear words like implicit bias, then we start to pull back a little bit. Because what happens is we get this notion that if we have a bias, we're a bad person. And that is not the case. There's wonderful work by Benanji and Hansen. They talk about good and hidden biases of good people, right? So we can talk about biases in the sense of food, right? Generic, or name brand. That's easy. We can talk about that all day. We can talk about biases when it comes to milk chocolate, dark chocolate, white chocolate. Feels good, right? The moment we put a human in that conversation, then we start to shut down. And so if we're going to build our own cultural competency, we need to understand what biases that we hold. We also need to understand that if you have a pulse, everybody in here, we all have a bias. A bias is not a bonus that you get because you're a shade of brown, right? Culture is not a bonus that you get because you're a shade of brown. Diversity is not a bonus that you get because you're a shade of brown. You have to name the differences. And so when we think about the biases, we have to examine which biases that we hold. Especially when it comes to business, we have to understand that the dynamics of the demographics that we have in this city and this community and the expectation for successful outcomes, are we truly creating unintentional barriers for people to enter into our spaces? So when we have posters and books and materials, when we have meetings and conversations, are we using language that is causing people to feel excluded? So what is a bias? It really refers to these social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. So when we say, I don't have a bias, what science tells us is that if you know of a stereotype, you have a bias. Now, do you act on it is the question, right? And we all have been primed and fed stereotypes, whether it's around women, whether it's about certain jobs, whether it is about race or ethnicity, whether it is about socioeconomic status and poverty, we've all been fed these narratives. So if we have a culture that has not interrupted any biases that have low expectations for particular people, we're not likely going to shift our outcomes, right? So if we're aware of the stereotype, we more than likely have the bias. The other part is that researchers have found evidence that most people have some form of these hidden biases because they stem from our natural tendency to associate things. Our brain is trying to say, man, woman, whatever race or ethnicity, whatever socioeconomic status, our brains are automatically doing that. The part that's key is the word implicit. We don't know it's happening. So sometimes someone have to say to you in a meeting, you know, Michelle, I noticed that every time Jim talks, you turn your body so that your back is to him. And you say, really? I didn't know I did that. And I say, yes, every time Jim does it. That may be an unconscious response to a potential bias that you have to the individual that's speaking. And you don't know it's happening until someone brings it to your attention, right? So we have to think about simple biases. You tell your friend you're going to go to the doctor next week, and then you go to the doctor and your friend says, how was the appointment? And you say, it was great. And the friend says, well, what did he say? And you say, well, she said, right? These biases unconsciously just show up in our minds and we don't realize they happen. The other thing, reminder, everyone has a bias. So when we're thinking about a business standpoint, if we have decided who fits best in our organization, right? Whether that's age, race, language, socioeconomic status, if the culture of your business says there's one parameter that people need to fit in to be here, how then are you valuing diversity? How then are you truly building some competency and core understanding around the culture and dynamics of your individual selves and your organization? It takes work. The other thing is that implicit biases can harm candidates in educational and professional settings. There's research that shows that there are biases in application processes, that people weed out names that sound more ethnic than more American and traditional sounding names. So if a candidate is weeded out before they can even get to the interview process, how then do they have a successful opportunity to be a valuable member of your agency, right? So we have to examine the culture of truly what are the values, beliefs, and systemic processes that may hinder the successes that we have and we want. Next, as individuals, we must be aware of what our biases are and how we may act on them. So we need to do this work of understanding what biases that we hold, what is the concept of what the culture is of our organization, what are our own cultural values and beliefs, so then we can decide, are we acting on that? We may need to bring people in the room that have a lived experience that's different from ours to maybe help us check some of our biases, because again, they are implicit. The other piece is, as an institution or organization, we need to be aware of institutional discrimination and how to mitigate it at every level. And so we may say we mean well, we do well, but when you step back and look at your data, look at your hiring practices, who have you hired in the last 3 to 5 years? When you look at the organizations that you support or agencies that you partner with, who have you partnered with in the last 3 to 5 years? When you start to have conversations about the community, what language are you using to describe the community and how are we serving? So we need to really think about what is the cultural awareness that we have and how do we build that capacity to shift and to grow. So the biases are a key component of gaining your understanding around cultural competency. So there are barriers to becoming like culturally proficient, and we need to identify how these barriers show up. The one is this unawareness of the need to adapt. It's the way we've always done it. It's great. Let's just keep doing it. So what, 2 or 3 people struggle with it? No big deal. So we don't know that we have changes that need to be made, not recognizing this need to make personal and organizational changes to better serve people within our organization. Sometimes we just keep going. And what has happened right now is people's beliefs and practices have been interrupted. And now people are saying, oh no, we need to do this, this, or that. Or, oh no, I can't believe we haven't done this. Well, they were really functioning in this unawareness of this need to adapt. People are being very public and very present with their voices. People are addressing concerns that they see. They're talking to organizations and agencies. There's an expectation that we shift our practice. And so now we can no longer say that we're in this unawareness of this need to adapt. But we have many people that sit in this space. The next is this resistance to change. And we know many people do not like to change. When we think about opposing or struggling with modifications or even transformations that alter that status quo, right? Really thinking about when it comes to issues that involve culture. We have a community of young people that are coming into our businesses that have different values around work and schedule. There used to be the conversation where no earrings and tattoos were allowed, and now everyone has them, right? So there's a culture shift of what's happening. So if we're going to continue to be resistant to the change and keep the old guard of people in the places, we may not have successful, equitable, and culturally competent outcomes. So we have to be aware of any barriers that show up in building our own cultural competency. The other part we have to understand, and this kind of hits home to where we are today, is understanding these systems of privilege and oppression. And so when we start talking about privilege and oppression, people get into a space of real discomfort. But I cannot have a cultural competency conversation with you without talking about implicit bias, without talking about barriers, without talking about systems of privilege and oppression. And we've got to know that there are just historical contexts of how people live and show up. And so while you may not be responsible for any hurt or pain that someone's experienced, you may resemble it. Your structure may resemble it. And we have to be able to lean into that. And so when we think about the systems of privilege and oppression, we really think about these institutionalized practices and policies that produce inequities, right? Around awarding unearned benefits of privilege and undeserved penalties of oppression. So what happens here is when we get into the oppression Olympics, and that's what I like to call it. So I tell you that as a Black woman, I've had these experiences, and then you counter me with, well, I was white and I was poor, and then I counter you. So we have this oppression Olympics, and guess what? No one hears anyone. So what I need you to do is hear me. My job is not to devalue your lived experience, but if you can't hear me, you cannot process what I'm saying to you or even gain any understanding. So we need to be able to hear one another so that we can shift and grow. So when we think about systems of privilege and oppression, there are those that are harmed and there are those that benefit. And the people that are harmed typically show up with an emotional response. We see very emotional responses happening right now. We have protesting happening all across the country. That is an emotional response of people that feel harmed. And so when we think about it, when someone comes in a space and they're pouring their whole heart out in pain and frustration, we need to stop and step back and ask, where is that coming from? Because our first response is to defend and deflect. That's not what we meant, and it can't be that bad. Opposed to saying, what is it that's caused you to feel that way? So we have a responsibility to lean in even when we're uncomfortable. The next is those, many of those who benefit from historical and current practices, they're usually oblivious to what's happening. It's like the horses with the blinders on. The horse's goal is to get to the finish line. They typically don't see what's outside of them. Doesn't make you a bad person if you don't see these experiences. It just means that that's not your lived experience. But the problem happens when you decide, well, I am not going to engage in this dialogue because it's not real. And we have to understand this is where some of the colorblind conversation comes in. So people that are benefiting from historical and current practices are kind of oblivious. And I hear the, well, I don't see color. Well, guess what? That's not real. Sorry to break it to you. But if you can find a crayon in a box of crayons, you see color. There is nothing wrong with seeing color. It is what you do. What is your response? I have to let you know, like when I walk into a room, I am a Black woman 365 days of the year. If you don't see that, what you're essentially telling me is you don't see part of who I am. And there's nothing wrong with seeing that. It's if you make an assumption, you have a belief, or you have some worry about the level of engagement. So when we walk in a space of blindness, we have to understand that it may be a protective armor for you, but it's not necessarily protective for other people. So we have to consider, are we entering into unhealthy practices or healthier practices that help us grow and shift and change? So sometimes we choose to go numb to some things, or we look at the foreboding joy of this is going to be awful if I enter into this conversation. Or we fall into the system of this perfectionism where we feel like we have to be right. So what politically correct term do I use today instead of asking the individual? So we have to understand that there are so many tools out there that help us shift and grow and understand how our practice changes. The last of the barriers is the sense of entitlement. And this is really talking about this belief that one's achievements and benefits are deserved because they were fairly earned and awarded. Now let me pause here for a minute, because people may read this and say, I worked hard for what I got. I worked really hard to get here. This statement is not discounting your hard work and what you did to get to the level that you are. This statement is acknowledging that there are individuals that work just as hard, but there are barriers in place that prevent them from getting to a successful point. We have to acknowledge this. So this cultural competency conversation is not just a single siloed discussion. You have to talk about barriers. You have to talk about biases. You have to talk about the shifts and practices that occur, and what are we doing around healthy and unhealthy practices within our organizations. So this consciousness flowchart has been used and modified across a lot of different things. And what I want to talk to you about is we just don't know what we don't know, right? We make a lot of mistakes. You're going to say statements that you probably shouldn't be saying. And some of it happens out of just pure lack of knowledge, right? There's no intentional harm behind it. But if you continue to stay in that barrier, this unawareness of this need to adapt, then you're not willing to grow. So we have to be able to shift. So one of the things that we look at is understanding this I don't know phase, right? This is acting based on ignorance and lack of understanding. So you've made the statement, you've created the policy, you didn't really talk to anybody, you thought it was great. So that was your I don't know, but I don't know, right? That's acting out of just some lack of knowledge. But then you want to shift some of that work. So you want to move this I don't know, but I think I do. This is when your assumptions are guiding you, but they're not quite verified. So this is where some awakening of the consciousness, you created that policy and you went, oh, I probably should have talked to someone. Or this is still creating more barriers. So you're going to shift here, right? You have some awakening of that consciousness. You're going to acquire some information, right? You're going to challenge your assumptions. You're going to be better equipped with knowledge and you're going to take another stab at it. But when you take this next step and you move here, you're going to move from this I don't know, but I think I do, to I know, I don't know, right? Because now you're like, I got all the answers and yeah, I screwed that up big time. And that's okay, because we're going to make mistakes. No one is perfect. This work of cultural competency is a journey. If you feel like I've been on this journey for 15 years and I'm still not getting it, because culture changes, right? People change, the dynamics of people change. So really thinking about, I don't know, I know I don't know. So now you're going to exercise some will. So here, jumped out, made a decision. Here, realize you have some work to do. To get here, now I'm going to change some things. This is where action starts. So you exercise your will by actively engaging in the expansion of your knowledge and understanding. You're going to read some books. You're going to come into the Chamber of Commerce cultural competency session. You're going to shift some practices. You're going to start having conversations with people you typically don't talk to. You're going to reevaluate your practice. And where that will comes is when you get into the I know. And you can get there, right? Only at that point do you begin to exist in full consciousness. So a lot of us want to just start there, right? And not own any of this. And what you have to remember is you may walk through this flow chart with the policy and then in a conversation end up back over here. It's okay. We want to be finished. We want to be complete. We want to say that we completed the class, give me my certificate, right? But this is a journey and it is a long journey. So what I ask individuals that enter into genuine, intentional leadership and commitment is how much can you endure? How long are you willing to be in this? Because for many of us, we've been doing this our whole lives and the generations before us and the generations before us. So it's not a day that we're like, whew, I'm tired because I've just gotten into this. I've watched this generationally occur. So this work around cultural competency is deep and embedded work. It's deep and intentional work. And it's work that takes a great deal of endurance. So I love this model from the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority. And it really helps you think about kind of where are you in your own journey. So whether you're unable or able, whether you're willing or unwilling, it gives you some perspective to start to self-reflect. So you can step back and think about the attitudes and skills and knowledge that you have. And let's say right now, you're probably in a willing but unable place, right? So if you're willing and unable, you're probably like developing this eagerness. I really want to do it. Some things, you already know, but the unable part may be the emerging state of awareness, but not the knowledge, right? I'm eager, I want this. I'm not sure what to do with it. You may have some low expectations, still be dealing with some lip service. Right? So you have a burning desire to do it, but you're not really sure what the next step is or how to have that conversation. If you're willing and able, you can see this aspiration, the target goal and objective, it's embedded, takes on board high expectations. The unwilling but able, right? Your unwillingness may be uncertainty. You may have some foreboding joy. If I do this, there are consequences. If I do this, how will people respond? If I do this, I may lose some friends. There's fear, you're not prepared to take the risk. But able, right? You're consolidating, you're wanting to know, you're in position to put knowledge and support in. If you're in position to make change, there is also weight to it, right? So you have to decide, where are you across a model? It gives you an opportunity to reflect and evaluate. There are many tools out here, but this is just one that you can consider. Okay. So when we think about all of the tools and resources, how do we really start to bring these things together? We want to ask ourselves, why improve your cultural competency? Why not just keep going the way we've been going? Why not just allow things to be the way they've been? Well, we really want to address organizational unconsciousness. We have to acknowledge that organizational culture, it's more or less kind of this enduring collection of these basic assumptions, right? This is the way we've done things. We've developed this learning structure. We're going to keep it that way. We also want to look at organizational patterns and norms and behaviors. Oftentimes, there's deep-seated company characteristics. Often, they're the reason for efforts to change organizational behaviors. They fail, right? You are like, we want to get this new policy. We want to shift this, but there's still that foundational piece that's like, we're not ready for that. Or we'll make a poster, but we're not going to change our hiring practices, right? We'll make a statement, but we're not going to shift the organizational media output and information that we put out. So we have to be better about that. And then the last is, we have to understand that despite some of our best conscious efforts, the organizational unconsciousness, it still perpetuates the status quo. And so there's a lot of effort and energy happening in place, but for many, it's still things that are rooted in the patterns, the values, and behavioral norms. We have to shift out of that. And so that's one of the key reasons, several of the reasons why we want to improve our cultural competency. So what are our next steps, right? We get all this information and your heads are probably thinking, that's a lot of information in 40 minutes, but that's okay. It's a journey. My job today was not to answer all of your questions. My job was to scratch the surface, to give you some beginning thoughts around cultural competency. So what we want to think about is, you want to assess your areas of future growth. So consider, what are things that you can do in the right now? What are things that you can do within your own sphere of influence? Really start to assess your individual growth and your organizational growth. The second is, you want to reflect on how might you do things differently in your practice and behavior. So a lot of us are sitting in this, I didn't realize the language I was using is harmful. I didn't realize that this policy or practice that I had might have been damaging. I did not realize that we were creating unintentional barriers. We may be sitting in some of that. And that's okay, because there's these layers of guilt and fragility that we experience, and we need to shift out of that, because otherwise it will paralyze us and we will not have growth. So when we think about reflecting on how we might do things differently in our practice or behavior, think about our language, think about our practices and our policies, think about our behavior. Take inventory of the 5 to 10 people that you spend most of your time with and who you talk to, and what is the conversation like. Really start to reflect on some of that. Number 3 is, consider the leadership implications of your future growth, right? Weigh those consequences. Like I told you, this is an endurance. I don't work and do the work around equity or cultural competency because I think it's going to be over tomorrow, right? I'm committed to this work. I'm committed to gaining my own knowledge, and I'm committed to building capacity of others. So we have to understand, what are the leadership implications of that growth? And as you do those 3 things, really, these next steps include cultural competency in your policies, include it in your mission and vision statements, project plans, and other resources or documents that define your expectations for your people. If you have the responsibility to build language and you embed the language, you institutionalize into your practice and your policies, if they're working on projects, we need to be able to have it at the forefront of the conversation and not be reacting to what's very public and present for us right now. The next is really, be sure to get buy-in from key stakeholders and influence within your team or organization. They're the ones who will be willing to take this vision and prepare into practice. So you walk into your building, your meeting, you're like, we really want to work on our valuing diversity. We really want to work on our cultural competency. And the people in the room are saying, why are we doing that? I don't want to do that. I don't believe in that. The likelihood of that work happening is going to fail. When we say we want to diversify our workforce, I ask often, what does that mean? So when we have 2 people in a room, we have diversity, okay? It's not a bonus that you get for a shade of brown, but then we can name it racial diversity, gender diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but we don't want to name that. So we have to be responsible for the language that we use. Sometimes we put people in bad position because we have not given them the proper information. So if you start your meeting off with, we want to diversify our workforce, women may say, oh, you want more women. People of color may say, oh, you want more people of color. Men may, we have to be intentional about the language, okay? And then the last is really recognize and reward instances of cultural competency, even if it's just with positive attention. So if you have people in meetings that are understanding and calling out or bringing something to the table, recognize and award it. It becomes threaded through your agency. It becomes threaded through your practice. And you really want to ensure that you're shifting and growing the way you need to. If you're just making statements for the sake of making statements, the likelihood of that happening for growth is not going to work. So we want to really think about what are these next steps. The other thing I will tell you is that be mindful of your next steps. Oftentimes when people hear this information, they're ready to charge the field, right? I'm ready to do it and I want it to change right now. You have to decide what you can do. So maybe you take one small step at a time, but what I encourage you to do is keep moving forward. So when it becomes difficult, that's when you ask yourself, how much can I endure? When people start to press up against and say, why are you doing this? You need to ask yourself, how much can I endure? So as your cultural competency skills and awareness become deeper and wider, it may cause a little bit more of a rub for some of the ethical tension that you have each day. This cultural awareness is a place of when we open up your eyes, it does not cut off. And so when you institutionalize it into your practice, into your agency, and hold it as core foundational piece to your knowledge, it should not cut off. And so we really need to examine ourselves and ask ourselves, what can be our next steps? Okay. So with that said, I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, or thoughts from you. And I don't know if we're taking calls or thoughts from our audience.
We might be when we get to it, but we'll go ahead and start in the room first.
Okay.
And then we'll see if we've got anything in the chat.
Okay. All right. Questions, comments,
I don't have any.
thoughts, ahas?
I'll kick us off with one. So
Okay.
I think what's so difficult about this time is that, you know, we're starting to have these conversations and this awareness is growing over equity and disparities in equity in the United States and here in Reno-Sparks at a time when we need to be socially distant during a pandemic. And we're talking to each other through screens and not really feeling connected to one another because we're not able to gather as we're used to and have conversations with maybe the ease and intimacy that we're used to.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations on how to make these conversations as compassionate and effective as possible when you can't always be in the same room?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemics, there's an S there, right? Because we're in COVID-19 pandemic, and then we're in a racial and social injustice layers of pandemic. So I say pandemics. And it's really difficult because of COVID-19. But what I would caution you is really, I've been paying a lot of attention to whose face is on the screen, right? And typically I'm one of few, if not only, a black face, a brown face on a screen. And so I'm always taking inventory of wondering whether or not the people on screen recognize that and understand what that means. Because it's isolation in itself to walk into a room and not see people that look like you or connect to you. But then to be on screen to see people that don't look like you or connect to you. And it's not meaning that there cannot be a connection, but I think what we need to understand is there are very public things that are happening that we don't want to talk about because we want to stay in polite conversations where you may not be carrying the weight that I'm feeling, but I can't engage in a lighthearted discussion if I'm in pain. And so when we think about the shifts around the cultural competency is that I have a lived professional experience and then I have a lived personal experience. And if we have a responsibility to people to understand and connect to that. So even though we're in COVID-19 and we have to have these social justice, these social distance issues that are impeding some of our social justice connections, sometimes we may have to say, you know, I just want to do a check-in and how's everyone doing? Opposed to when we start talks off with, tell me something good, because guess what, today I don't have anything good for you. Well, today I do because it's my birthday, but I may not have anything good. So language, the culture of how we engage in practice is often isolating for individuals. So people are in very heavy mental and social, emotional places right now. And sometimes our process of doing things that's kind of steeped in this, and I say this term because it comes from an article, but a white supremacy cultural way of doing business that can isolate people that don't fit into a dominant structure, if that makes sense. So we've got to really think about, how people are landing and sitting on screens and living. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's maybe even just, if you have a daily check-in with your team, setting aside some time to say, okay, like this is the time to talk about what's, maybe something that in your life that you're grateful for, or maybe something's grieving you.
Yeah.
That, you're opening up that space for grief and for conversation and for allowing people, being someone who leads in vulnerability in that way.
Yeah.
To be able to share those things.
Yeah. And moving from some of the unhealthy to healthy practices will require us to be vulnerable. Yeah. Right? Means we may have to relinquish some control. And that means we have to step out of our cultural norm way of doing things. Yeah. Other questions or comments or thoughts? Because I know there's comments, I see things popping up on screen.
I've got another one.
Okay.
I could probably ask a million.
That's
questions.
Okay. That's what I'm here.
I guess because you've been in Reno-Sparks for
30 years.
30 years. You've seen so much change. What would you say over time the biggest barriers to equity and cultural competency have been, specifically in Reno-Sparks? Because I know we're a little different than some bigger urban centers on the West Coast or the East Coast, or even in the Midwest, or even smaller towns that are surrounding us.
Yeah.
What have you specifically seen in our area?
I can say in my experience, and I referred to it earlier, is this unwillingness to relinquish power, right? I'm gonna be real honest with you. When we talk about cultural competency, systemic and institutional barriers, there is still various forms of institutionalized racism and discrimination that happens in organizations and policies. And so if we decide that a person only has a certain amount of skill sets and who has power to allow people in, the likelihood of things changing is not going to happen. So when we look at who is in position of power that holds decisions, who is in position of power who are in office, how are we mentoring, guiding, opening those doors? So for me, over the last 30 years, I've been fortunate to make really healthy and solid connections, professionally and personally. Have I experienced a lot of barriers? Yes, but I often see people's unwillingness to relinquish power. And in order for someone else to gain power, someone has to let some of it go. And we know where money is held, and we know where property is held, we know where power and decision is held, whether it's in education or it's in business. I mean, I think that there are more people having some willingness to shift that, but that also means how willing are they to relinquish power?
Totally. Like the thing that comes to my mind specifically with policy and things that are just embedded are, how a lot of our home deeds have been written, and how even just months ago, in Washoe County, there was a movement to change the language
and the CCNRs,
racist language in those documents, and that it's 2020, and that's only just now happening.
Yeah.
So I think it's such a good reminder to dig out those employee handbooks. I know you work in HR, so you're embedded in that employee handbook all the time. But to read through it and to say, what's written here that's exclusionary? Like what in here needs to change? What needs to be reevaluated?
And just thinking about getting back to this cultural competency conversation, that unawareness of the need to adapt, right? So for many people buying a home, that may not impact them, right? But a person of color buying a home and seeing that this was still in the books in this state, and a home that you own, saying that you technically can't live in the community where you purchased property, right? So most people may not even know that because it does not affect them. And so it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that you were blind to what was happening. So now that you know, what do you do? that's where the work comes. Because we can't sit in the I don't know forever. Now that you know, where's the skill, will, and ability to shift your practice? Other thoughts or comments? Other questions?
Right. Well, maybe we'll take a look at chat to see
Okay.
if there's anything popping there.
All right. I see words, but I
All right,
my
let's take a
glasses are
look
not that
here.
good.
All right. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Here's a question.
Okay.
You've touched on leveraging feedback from community stakeholders. With this notion in mind, what advice would you have for a young professional developing a cultural competency training for Nevada healthcare providers? That's a great question.
Call me. There's that. Definitely partnership opportunity, but also I'm reading. And so it gets back to who's in charge of the training and what is the system. So for instance, I've shared this conversation. I was looking at a doctor the other day and I looked online and Reno had cultural competency training, but then it said no information yet. And I was like, ding, 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 right? So Reno, call me. But I was also saying for the healthcare professional is really making sure you're clear on what your messaging is. So are you going to be talking about the disparities in healthcare for people of color and how healthcare professionals need to be trained? Or are you trying to give healthcare professionals knowledge to have cross-cultural communication? I mean, I think you need to lay out what is your goal, and then whoever the partner is that you have, what their expectations are too. Because what I caution people right now is it is like ripe time for everyone who can do equity work and cultural competency work and diversity work. And some people do an amazing job and some people not so much. And so I don't have the moral compass to say going to an organization that says I want to do equity and diversity work, but it's not the work I do, and then sign up to do something that's a disservice. So you want to be clear about what is it within healthcare that you want to talk about. Are you going to talk about Dr. Cross's work around cross-cultural communication? I mean, there's several layers of it, but it depends on what your focus is to the question.
Let's see what else we've got in chat. Okay. Let's see, here's another question. Everyone is on a different step in their journey toward equality. So it's easy to feel either superior or scared and offended if you are not at the same step than the rest of your peers. How can we foment empathy while at the same time not allowing others to continue overt bias?
That's a great question. One of the things I would say is we first have to separate words. So equity and equality are two different things. And we use that interchangeably all the time. So equality is just that, same, right? So we're all gonna go out to the shoe store today, and the equal approach is that the person is gonna come out and they're gonna give us all a size 9. That's an equal approach. We equally get a pair of shoes. Equitably, they're going to size each of us and figure out which size best fits us individually. That's the equity work, right? So we wanna be clear that we're understanding the difference between equality and equity. They're not the same. The other thing is that gaining empathy means that you're going to be willing to hear other people. So when I talked about not entering into that oppression Olympics, some people you're going to just have to accept are not going to hear it. Some people are not going to accept it. Some people are not going to change. But if people can get into a space enough to say systems of privilege and entitlement exist, there are barriers that are in place, and that we have a culture that needs to shift, then you can maybe get to a place where you can get some empathy and they can start to gain some understanding. But it takes time. This is not a one conversation piece of work. This is not a one workshop piece of work. This is not a one book piece of work. This is genuinely and truly a journey.
Alrighty, let's see what else we've got here. Okay, so we've got another quick question. Looks like it's a bit of a follow-up.
Okay.
It starts with us challenging ourselves and each other, as well as introducing accountability to face those biases and fears and explore them. That's part of the journey.
Yep.
The question now is how.
That's a whole nother 16 hours of training. And yeah, so but the how is a lot of work. I mean, there's a lot of tools. Some tools don't work for others, but the how is really also reminding yourself that it's difficult to do in isolation. So you need to get a collective around you, and it doesn't have to be 50 people, it may just be 2, that you can really start to explore your own biases, that you're reading with, that you're reflecting, but making sure that people don't have the same lived experiences of you. You need someone that's going to interrupt your narrative, and you also do the same for them so that you can grow. The how is ongoing. You may want to specialize your information around socioeconomic status and people of color. Well, someone else has a strength around education and people of color. Someone else may have some institutionalized barrier conversation around businesses and organizations. But the how begins with, as you said, the accountability and reflective self-work, and then starting to name it. We've got to name the struggle, name the biases, and then name how it lands in your daily practice. Again, we either foundationally hold to the way we were raised and hold on to it to be right, or we run as far away from that as possible and we take these sprinkles in between. And so it's ongoing work. And it's not work that, I'm going to stay in this for 6 months and everything's going to be okay. We may have to revisit this on a continuous basis. So when I tell people, when they say, I want training, and I'm like, okay, do you want training or do you want a workshop? Because those are 2 different things. Training is going to be ongoing, and it's going to mean I need to come back and see you in next year and the year after and the year after. Okay.
I've got another question.
Okay.
And again, if anybody in chat online has any questions, fire them off right now. We've still got a good 5 to 7 minutes, so just fire those away. You've walked into a lot of organizations in your career, and you've probably seen the gamut between organizations that are ripe and ready to have these conversations and make deep structural change, and organizations that are resistant. And I mean, organizations that are more resistant may not even call you in the first place, but but what would you say are some of the things that the key indicators of an organization that you think is going to succeed in making change versus the key red flags that you see in an organization that is just not ready or is just too resistant to change?
A key organization that's ready has assessed where they are and had some accountability, right? So assessing where you are and going, yeah, we have some problems, we have some barriers, but we're just going to keep doing the way things are, they're not ready. But if they have done the work, they've looked at data, they've examined their practices, and now they say, okay, we need to do something to mitigate this, and they take the steps, accountability is there. That's an organization that's ready. An organization that's not, that is saying, this is just all this public things that are happening right now, and why do we need to change, right? And the cultural competency conversation is not just about race, but it is inclusive of. You cannot have that conversation without having a race conversation. And so when we sit in organizations and say, well, that's not really our demographic, it doesn't matter, it is really gets to the moral fabric of the organization. What is it that you want to stand for? And do you, in fact, want to shift the outcomes, right? That's work that we have to do. And so if you're not willing to assess, and you're definitely not going to hold anyone accountable, then the likelihood that you're going to grow is not going to be there.
All right. Anything from you guys here in person? Any other questions? Now's the time. We still got time.
Yeah. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I think one of the questions that comes from my organization a lot is we're a board-led organization. And we have the conversation about being more diverse.
Okay, which diverse? Racially?
And that's one of the questions that our board struggles to answer. I think a lot of it is out of fear of saying the wrong thing. But then it's like, how do we recruit or solicit people that bring that diversity to our board while still being like culturally competent and sensitive to what's going on? Because our board is it's heavily white males. And we have a few women, we have a few from a few people of color, but there's definitely viewpoints that we're missing in the room. And so for us, like we don't know how to go about recruiting diversity in a way that is sensitive and
it's not offensive
and culturally competent, right?
Yeah. So one of the things you want to do is identify what you mean. Like and fear is real and it's normal and it's okay. Right? You're going to make mistakes and you may need to call someone to come in and help you, but you have to figure out what you mean first. because again, you get lost in the blanket statements, because the people in the room, when you say we want to diversify our board, we want to they hear what diversity means to them. So as an organization, as a leader of a business, you need to be clear on what you mean. So you may have to step back and ask those questions. When we say we want to diversify, what are we talking about? Are we talking about race? Are we talking about gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation? You have to name it. And then once you name it, then you need to ask why. So why then are we diversifying this group? And then when you decide on your why, then you can get to the how, right? But we want to always just jump to the how. Because if you want to racially diversify your board, why? Do you want to do it just because you want to do it? Do you know that there are other lived experience and voices, as you said, or some information that's missing? Do you know that? Then how? The how will come in, whether it's recruitment, whether it's hiring, whether it's relationship, whether it's publications. I mean, so all of that will happen, but you've got to figure out the what, then you can get to the why, then you can get to the how.
So I think we're missing the what step.
Yeah.
We have the why.
Yes.
The people that we serve are not reflected in our board.
Yes.
And so that's our why, right? Is
Yeah.
because we understand that who we're serving is not being reflected in the level that's making the decisions for the organization.
Yeah.
It's the what and then the how that we
Yeah.
need to.
And then when you diversify that body or that space, then you also need to make sure that you're still not creating institutional barriers when they come, right? So are they there for the value added piece of their voice, skill, and knowledge? Or are they there just to say you did it, right? So we've got to have some real ownership about that as well. Thank you, great question.
Anything else?
Alrighty, maybe we have time for one quick thing
Okay,
from chat.
I see
If we've
things
got
popping
anything
up on
else.
screen.
Ooh, good. Let's see. Okay. All right, here we go. One more question. If you are trying to educate others on cultural competency over a shorter training, less than 10 hours, are there specific points that must be touched upon in your opinion? Oh man.
Yeah, so call me. I would be doing you a disservice to try to answer that for you in a long time. A 10-hour training is great because I think that anything under 2 hours is tough, but you really need to also make sure that one of the biggest pieces is there's reflection. You cannot give information to people over long periods of time, especially on a topic like this, that they don't have opportunity to reflect and engage on. So those are always key components to training and providing professional development / professional learning, which is our new terms. But I would definitely say reach out to me and maybe we can consider some thought partnerships and talk about that. So,
perfect. All right, everybody in the room and then online, we're going to go ahead and wrap everything up. We're just past 1 o'clock. I just want to thank everyone for coming here, for starting these difficult conversations, and drilling down and really starting to ask yourselves the questions. And me, I'm asking myself the question, what do I need to change? What can I do? Who can I talk to? Who can I bring in? This is where it starts. And I want to thank you all for joining us today to just start this journey. And I want to thank you, Tiffany, and say a happy birthday.
Thank you.
I do have a cake and a card for you.
Cake.
I know. But everybody online, I want you to sing happy birthday. I know we can't hear you.
You can't.
But
You
we
can just
feel
type it
you.
in the chat.
Just type
You
it
can
in the
just-
chat. Give us some love. But I want to thank everyone once again. And of course, a reminder, I'm going to be sending out the recording. Unfortunately, we started recording a little bit late, so it chops off the first minute and a half or so. But I'm going to send that recording out to everyone so you can digest this information more, keep watching it, keep thinking about it, keep growing from it. And of course, if you need anything, get in contact with me. You all have my email address. And also Tiffany's email address is on the screen and in your class materials. So you should be all set to go. I want to thank everyone once again for coming and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day.